Chapter 3. The days went by, and Andres lay sick. There was no great change either for the worse or for the better. The worse was he scarce got any sleep. The boy lay there with half-open eyes and seemed not to know anybody. Cough and breathlessness wrung his wasted little frame, and the flickering fever rose and fell. One evening Kristin had given him a soothing drink. After it he sank into rest, but in a while she saw the child had gone a bluish-white, and his skin felt cold and clammy. In all haste she got a draught of hot milk poured down his throat, and laid hot stones to the soles of his feet. But thereafter she no longer dared give him a sleeping potion. She saw that he was too young to support it. Cyrus Solomon came and brought him the holy elements from the church. Simon and Ramborg vowed perpetual prayer, fasts and alms, if God would hear them and grant their son his life. Erland came to them one day. He would not get off from his horse and go within, but Kristin and Simon came out into the courtyard and spoke with him. He looked on them most sorrowfully. It was strange that this look of his ever stirred in Kristin a vague, dull anger. It was certain that it gave him pain when he saw any sick or sorrowing, but he seemed most of all amazed and shamefaced. He ever looked so helpless when he was sorry for folk. After that, Nakvi or the twins came each day to Formoe to ask after Andres. The seventh night brought no turn in the sickness, but as the day drew on the boy seemed a little better, not so hot. Simon and Kristin were sitting alone by him towards midday. The father pulled out a little gilded amulet he wore on a cord about his neck under his clothes. He bent down over the boy, dangled the amulet before his eyes, thrust it into the child's hand and pressed the little fingers together around it. But Andres seemed not to heed. This amulet Simon had given him when a child, and he had borne it ever since. His father had brought it with him from France. It had been blessed in a cloister named St. Michael's Mount, and there was on it the likeness of St. Michael with great wings. This Andres liked right well to look upon, Simon told her, very low. But the little fellow deemed it was a cock. He called it the chief of all the angels, the cock. At last he had got the boy taught to say the angel. But one day, when they were standing in the courtyard, Andres saw the cock pecking at one of his hens. "Angel angry now, father," he said. Kristin looked up at the man beseechingly. It cut her to the heart to hear him, albeit Simon spoke so evenly and calmly. And she was so worn out by all these nights of watching. She felt she must break down if she began now to weep. Simon thrust the charm into the bosom of his shirt again. "I shall give a 3-year-old ox to the church on St. Michael's even, each autumn so long as I live, if he will but tarry a little ere he come to fetch this soul. I think it would weigh in the balance no more than a plucked chicken, Andres, my son. He's so little." But when he tried to laugh, his voice broke a little. "Simon, Simon," Kristin begged him. "Ah, it will be as it is willed to be, Kristin. And 'tis God himself that wills it. He must sure know best." The father spoke no more, but stood looking down upon his son. On the 8th night, Simon and one of the serving women watched, while Kristin slumbered a little over on the further bench. When she awoke, the girl was sleeping. Simon sat, as he had sat most nights, on the bench at the bedhead. He sat with his head bowed down over the bed and the child. "Is he sleeping?" whispered Kristin, going forward to him. Simon raised his head. He brushed his hand over his face. She saw that his cheeks were wet, but he answered low and calmly. I don't think, Kristin, that Andrews will sleep any more till he lies beneath the turf in holy ground." Kristin stood. It was as though she grew stark and stiff. Slowly she blanched beneath her sunburnt skin, grew white to the very lips. Then she went to the corner and took her outdoor cloak. "You must order it so." She spoke as though her throat and mouth were dry. "That you are here alone when I come back. You stay with him, and when you see me enter, say nothing, and speak no word of this after, either to me or to anyone, not even to your priest." Simon rose up, came slowly over to her. He too had grown pale. "No, Kristin." His voice could scarce be heard. I dare not. Do you have to go that road?" She wrapped her cloak about her, took a cloth of linen from the chest in the corner, folded it together and hid it in her bosom. "I do dare. You understand well? No one must come near us, nor speak to us, before he wakes, and he himself has spoken." "What do you think your father would think of this?" he whispered faintly as before. "Kristin, don't do it. I have done before now what my father thought was wrong. Then 'twas nothing but to forward my own lusts. Andrews is his flesh and blood too, my own flesh, Simon, my only sister's son." Simon breathed hard, trembling. He stood looking down. "But if you would prefer that I do not do this?" He stood as before with bowed head and made no answer. Thereon she said again, and knew not that a strange, nearly scornful half-smile had come about her white lips. "Would you prefer that I do not go?" He turned his head aside, and she went by him, stepped through the door noiselessly, and closed it softly behind her. Outside was thick darkness, with little puffs of south wind, so that all the stars flickered and blinked unsteadily. She had come no further than into the road between the fences, and yet it seemed as though she had passed out into the everlasting itself, an endless road behind her and before her, as though she would never come away from what she had stepped into when she set foot out into this night. The darkness itself seemed a power that she pressed forward against. She was walking in deep mud. The way had been ploughed up by the dung carts and was thawing in the south wind. At each step she must tear herself loose from the night, and the raw cold that clung about her feet sucked its way up and clogged the hem of her skirts. Ever and anon a falling leaf brushed by her, as though a living thing in the dark touched her softly, sure of its power. "Go back! Go back!" When she came out upon the highway, walking grew easier. It was grass-grown. Her feet stuck in the mud no longer. She felt her face stiff as stone, her body strung and taut. Each step bore her mercilessly towards the wood she must go through. An inner palsy seemed to mount up in her. It was impossible she could dare go through that murky passage. Yet she had no thought of turning. Terror had struck her body numb, yet she kept striding forward as though in sleep, stepping surely over stones and roots and puddles, all unaware, heedful not to stumble, not to drop her even gait and give her terror the mastery. Now the firs sighed nearer and nearer in the night. She passed in among them, still calm, as if sleepwalking. She was aware of every sound, and scarce dared move an eyelid for the darkness. The thunder of the river, the heavy sighing in the trees, the tinkle over stones of a beck that she drew near to, passed and left behind. Once, up on the scree, a stone rolled, as if some living thing stirred up there. Sweat burst out over her whole body, but she dared neither slacken nor hasten her gait. Kristin's eyes were now so used to the dark that, when she came out of the wood, she could see a little. There was a faint gleam upon the river, upon the waters of the marshes. The farmlands showed now against the blackness. The clusters of houses looked like cores of blacker gloom upon them. The sky, too, was surely lightening high above her as she went. She felt it, but dared not look up the black hillsides that towered up to heaven. But she knew it must soon be time for the moon to rise. She tried to remind herself, in 4 hours' time it will be day. Folks will be setting about the day's work on all the farms. The air will be grey with dawn. It will grow light above the hills. The way will not be long then. In the light 'tis not far from Formoe to the church. And long ere that, she herself would be home and within doors. But something told her that she would be somebody else, other than she was when she went forth. She knew, had it been for one of her own children's lives, she would never have tried to do this thing, turn God's hand aside when he had stretched it forth to take a living soul. As she sat over her own little ones, when she was young and her heart bled with tenderness, she had tried to say, when ready to sink with dread and anguish, "Lord, thou lovest them better than I. Thy will be done." Yet now she was here this night defying her own terror. This child was not hers, but this child she would save, whatever she might save it for. For you too, Simon Dar, when the dearest thing you owned on earth was the stake, I took at my hands more than any man may take with honour unabated. Would you prefer that I should not go? And he had not been man enough to answer. In her heart of hearts she knew. Were the child to die, that too Simon would somehow be able to bear. But she had swooped down upon that single hour when she found him at the breaking point, had seized the chance that moment gave her, and gone her way. This secret now she would share with him, that he knew that she too had seen him in an hour when he stood not so firmly on his feet. For he had come to know her too well. At the hands of the man she had thrown off, she had taken help each time there was need to save the man of her choice. The lover she had cast aside was the man she had turned to each time she stood in need of a shield for her love. And she had never besought Simon in vain. Time after time he had stepped forth to screen her with his kindness and his strength. So she walked this road through the night, that she might lighten a little the load of debt whose crushing weight till that hour she had never felt to the full. Simon had forced her to understand at the last that he was the strongest, stronger than she herself, and stronger than the man she had chosen to give herself to. She must indeed have felt it from the very hour when they three had met face to face in that shameful den in Oslo, though she would not see it then, that this lumpish, round-cheeked, talking youth was stronger than... So here she went, and dared not call upon a good and holy name, and took upon herself this sin that she might win. She knew not what. Was it revenge? Revenge for that she had been forced to see that he was worthier than either Kristin or Erland. But now you know it too, Simon. When 'tis for the life of him one loves more than one's own being, a poor human soul will grasp at anything at all. The moon had risen over the edge of the hills as she went up the slope towards the church. Again it was as though she must ride over a fresh wave of terror. The moonlight lay like a thin cobweb layer over the tar-sprent mass. The church itself stood under the thin veil, awful and threateningly black. For the first time she saw the great cross on the green outside, and dared not go there to bow down before the holy tree. She crept across where she knew the churchyard wall of turf and stone was lowest and easiest to climb. A gravestone here and there glistened like water in the long dewy grass. Kristin went straight across the churchyard, down to the poor folks' graves away by the south wall. She went to the place where lay a poor newcomer to the parish. The man had frozen to death on the mountains one winter. His 2 motherless daughters had been passed from house to house as bedesfolk, till Lavransdatter had proffered to keep them for Christ's sake and to give them nurture. They grew up and turned out well, and her father had himself sought out honest, hard-working men for them, and had given them away in wedlock, each with cow and calf and sheep, while Ranfried gave them beds and bedding and iron pots. Now they were thriving housewives, well-to-do in their own way of life. One had been Ramborg's serving maid, and Ramborg had borne children to baptism for her. So, now you must spare me a turf from your covering, Bjarn, for Ramborg's son. She knelt down and drew out her dagger. The sweat burst out in ice-cold beads upon her brow and upper lip as she dug her fingers in under the dew-wet turf. Something held it from below. 'Twas but roots. She cut them with the dagger. As repayment, the ghost must have gold or silver, passed down through 3 generations. She drew off the little gold ring with rubies that had been her grandmother's betrothal ring. The child is of my father's house. She thrust the ring down into the earth as deep as she could, wrapped the turf in the linen cloth, and covered the spot whence she had taken it with moss and leaves. As she rose to her feet, her legs beneath her trembled. She had to stand a little before she could turn. If she looked under her elbow now, she would see them. And there was a dreadful dragging within her, as though they would force her to it, all the dead who had known her in days gone by. "Is that you, Kristin Lavransdatter? Have you come hither?" Arnie Gerdson in the grave, outside the western porch. "Aye, Arn, well may you wonder. I was not that sort of person when you and I were friends." Then she climbed over the wall again and went her way downward. The moon shone now over the whole countryside. There lay Jorengard out on the river flat. Dew glittered in the grass on all the roofs. She looked down yonder, well nigh unmoved. It was as though she herself were dead to that home and everything inside it. The door barred for ever against her, who went by that night on the high road. Nearly all the road back was shadowed by the hills. The wind blew stronger now. Gust after gust pressed straight against her. Withered leaves blew against her, and would have turned her back from whence she had come. Nor did it seem to her that she walked alone. Of a sudden there would come a sound as of stealthy footsteps behind her. "Is that you, Arn?" "Look behind you, Kristin. Look under your elbow," it whispered. And yet it was as though she was rightly afraid no longer, only cold and numb, sick with longing to give up and sink down to the ground. Surely after this night she would never know fear again in this world. Simon sat in his wonted place at the head of the bed, bent over the child, when she opened the door and stepped in. For one short moment he looked up. Kristin wondered whether she had grown in this time to look as worn and marred and old. Then Simon bowed his face wholly down and hid it on his arm. He reeled a little as he rose. He turned his head away from her as he went by towards the door with stooping neck and shoulders. Kristin lit 2 candles and set them on the board. The boy opened his eyes a little, looked up unseeingly, frowned a little, and tried to turn his head away from the light. When Kristin laid the little body out straight, as one lays out a corpse, he tried not to change his posture. He seemed too weak to move. Then she covered his face and breast with the linen cloth and laid the strip of turf across it. With that, the horror rushed upon her anew, like a breaking sea. She must sit by the bed. The window was right over the short bench. She dared not sit there with her back to it. Better to look them in the eyes, if any stood outside looking in. She drew the high-backed chair up to the bed and sat facing the window. The night pressed in upon it, pitchy black. One of the candle's flames was mirrored in the glass. Kristin stared hard at it, clenching her hands round the chair arms, so that the joints stood out white and her arms behind them trembled. Her legs had no feeling in them, so cold and wet were they. She sat with her teeth chattering from fear and cold, the icy sweat pouring down her face and back. She sat motionless, threw but now and then a lightning glance upon the linen cloth that rose and fell ever so little with the child's breathing. At length the window pane began to grey. Cocks crew shrilly, and then she heard men in the yard. They were going to the stables. Limply she fell back against the back of the chair, shaking as in spasms, and tried to lie so as to still the twitching and jerking of her limbs. Then, beneath the linen cloth, something moved strongly. Andres pulled it from his face, whimpering peevishly. He seemed to have his senses in a fashion, for he grunted crossly at her when she started up and bent over him. She snatched up the cloth and the turf, ran to the fireplace, stuffed in twigs and wood, and flung the demon ware into the fresh, hissing, new-lit fire. But then she had to stand a little, leaning against the wall, tears trickling down over her face. She dripped milk from the little pot which stood by the hearth and took it to the child. Andres was asleep again already. It seemed now to be a healthy sleep. She drank the milk herself. It was so delicious that she had to swallow 2 or 3 dipperfuls of the warm drink. She dared not speak yet. The boy had said no word that could be understood, but she fell upon her knees by the bedfoot and said over to herself noiselessly, "Return, O Lord, how long? And let it repent thee concerning thy servants. Be not wroth, O Lord, neither remember iniquity for ever. Behold, see, we beseech thee, we are all thy people." Ah, yes, it was a fearful thing she had done. But he was their only son. She had 7. Shouldn't she have ventured everything to save her sister's only son? All that in this night she had been thinking. It was but a delusion of the night. To be sure, she had done it only because she could not bear to see the child die in her hands. Simon, he that had never failed her, he that had been faithful and kind to every mother's child she knew of, and best of all to her and hers. And this son he loved more than the apple of his eye. Shouldn't she make trial of everything to save the boy's life, even if it were a sin? Yes, it was sinful, but God
visited on me. This little fair innocent child of Simon and Rambourg, God surely would not let his wrath fall on him, on Andrus." She crossed the room and bent over the bed, breathed down upon one of the little wax-white hands. She dared not kiss it. He must not be waked. Bright and sinless. It was in those nights of horror, when they sat together alone at Haugen, that Lady Ashild had told her of this, told her of her faring to the graveyard at Konunghalle. "That, Kristin, be sure, is the heaviest task I ever took on my shoulders." But Bjorn Gunnarsson was no innocent child when he lay at death's door. Ashild Gautersdatter's sister's sons had come very close to his heart with their swords. He had killed one of them ere he had fallen, and the other was never a whole man again after the day he changed sword strokes with Sir Bjorn. Kristin stood by the window and looked out on the courtyard. Folk went hither and thither among the houses at their daily tasks. Some little heifer calves wandered about in the yard, so comely as they were. All manner of thoughts spring up in the dark, like to those filmy plants that grow in the sea and wave and rock themselves strangely, weirdly fair, awesome and enticing. They draw us with a strange dark lure, while yet they grow within their own living, wavering dusk. But, plucked up by the children and pulled into a boat, they are nothing but a brown, slimy clot. In the night, many and strange are the thoughts that spring up to lure and affright. Surely it was Brother Edvin that had said once, "The damned in hell would not themselves be parted from their torment. Hate and sorrow were their delight. Therefore it was that Christ could not save them." This had seemed to her wild talk then. A cold shudder ran through her. Now she began to understand what the monk had meant. She bent over the bed again, drinking in the air that breathed from the little child. Simon and Rambourg should not lose him. Even if it were true that she had done this out of her need to set herself right in Simon's eyes, to show him that she too was willing to do more than take gifts at his hands, a need had been in her to dare all that she might repay him. Then again she knelt down and said over and over again as much as she knew of the prayer book. That morning Simon went out and sowed winter rye on the new broken field, south in the wood. He had it in mind that he must make as though it seemed to him fitting that the work on the farm should go on its usual way. The serving women had fallen into great wonderment when he had come into them in the night and said that Kristin would be alone with the boy till she sent for them. He told Rambourg too when she awoke. Kristin had insisted that no one should go near the women's house today. "Not you either?" she asked quickly, and Simon said no. It was then that he had gone out and fetched the seed box. But after the midday meal time he stayed up at the manor. He had no heart to go far from the houses, and he didn't like the look in Rambourg's eyes. It came a while after the midday rest. He was standing by the corn barn, and he saw his wife rush across the yard. He sprang after. Rambourg flung herself at the door of the women's house and beat upon it with her clenched fists, shrieking wildly to Kristin to open the door. Simon put his arms about her, trying to soothe her. Thereon she bent quick as lightning and bit him on the hand. She seemed like some wild beast in her rage. "He is my child! What have you done with my son?" "You know well your sister is doing nothing but good to Andrus." When he took hold of her again, she shrieked and struggled against him. "Come now," said the man in a voice of feigned harshness. "Rambourg, are you not ashamed before the housefolk?" But she went on screaming. "He is mine! Mine, I tell you! "You were not with us when I bore him, Simon," she cried. "Then we were not so dear to you." "You know very well what I had in hand in those days," answered the man wearily. He dragged her away towards the hall by main strength. Thereafter he dared not leave her. In a while Rambourg grew quiet, and when the evening was come, she gave in to him and let the women undress her. Simon sat on by her side. His daughters were sleeping in their own bed. The serving women he had sent out. Once, when he rose and went across the room, Rambourg asked from the bed, she was wide awake by her voice, where he was going. "I had a mind to lie down a little by you," he answered after a moment. He took off his outer coat and shoes and crept in between the skins and the woolen coverlid. Then he put an arm under his wife's neck. "I know well, my Rambourg, that this has been a long day and a very heavy one for you." "Your heart, it beats so hard, Simon," she said soon after. "Yes, you may well believe I am in dread for the boy too. But we must wait in patience till Kristin sends us word." He started up in the bed, lay propped on his elbow, looked up wildly into Kristin's white face. It was close above his own and shone wet with tears in a glimmer of light. Her hand was on his breast. For one moment he thought, this time it was not a dream. Simon threw himself back against the bedhead. With a stifled moan he hid his face on his arm. He felt sick. The heart in him hammered so wildly and so hard. "Simon, wake up!" Kristin shook him again. "Andres is calling on his father. Don't you hear? It was the first word he spoke." Her face shone with smiles, while the tears ran down it without cease. Simon sat up and passed his hand once and again across his face. Surely he had not said anything as she woke him, while yet amazed with sleep. He looked up at Kristin. She was standing by the bed with a lantern in her hand. Softly, not to wake Rambourg, he crept out with her. The qualmish sickness still weighed upon his breast. He felt as though something would break within him. Why was he ever haunted by this hateful dream? He who, awake, strove and ever strove to drive all such thoughts from him. And then, while he lay sleeping, will-less and helpless, ever to dream this dream of the devil's own sending. Even now, while she sat watching over his son that lay sick to death, to dream like some monstrous wretch. It was raining, and Kristin could not rightly say what time of night it was. The boy had been half awake in the day, but he had not spoken. It was not till well on in the night that it had seemed to her he slept well and soundly, and she had dared to lie down a little herself and rest, with Andres in her arms, that she might feel if he moved. Then she had fallen asleep. The boy looked a tiny, tiny thing, lying alone in the bed. Woefully pale he was, but his eyes were clear, and his face lit up with smiles when he saw his father. Simon went down on his knees by the bedside, but when he would have taken the little one to his breast, Kristin caught him by the arm. "No, no, Simon. He's all sweating, and 'tis cold in here." She pulled the bedclothes closer about Andres. "Rather lay yourself down by his side. Then I will send a woman to watch. I am going to go now to the hall, to lie down by Rambourg." Simon crept in under the covering. There was a warm hollow where she had lain, a faint sweet scent of her hair on the pillow. Simon moaned very softly once. Then he drew his little son into him and pressed his face against the soft, damp child head. He was so small now, was Andres. He was well nigh nothing to hold in one's arms, but he lay there happily enough, saying a little word over and over again. Then he took to fumbling and groping in the opening of his father's shirt, put his little clammy hand in on the man's breast and pulled out the amulet. "The cock," he said, well pleased. "Here he is." The day Kristin stood ready to set forth for home, Simon came to her in the women's house and handed her a little wooden box. "I thought perhaps you would like to have this." Kristin knew by the wood carving that it was her father's work. Within there lay, wrapped in a bit of glove leather, a small golden clasp set with 5 emeralds. She knew it at once. Lavrans had used to wear it in his wristband at special times, when he would go richly clad. She thanked Simon, but then she blushed blood red. It had come to her all of a sudden that she had surely never seen her father wear this trinket after she had come home from the cloister in Oslo. "When did father give this to you?" She repented her of the question as soon as she asked it. "I got it for a parting gift once when I was riding from the manor." "This seems to me to be all too great a gift," she said low, with her eyes cast down. Simon laughed a little as he answered, "You will have need of many such, Kristin, when the time comes for you to send forth all your sons with bridal gifts." Kristin looked at him and said, "You know very well, Simon. I think that the things that have come to you from him, you know I hold you as dear as though you were his own son." "Do you so?" He touched her cheek lightly with the back of his hand, stroking it downwards, and smiled, a strange little smile, when he spoke as to a child. "Yes, Kristin, I have marked it.